The Wind River country in the early 1830s did not announce itself with any kindness. It crept upon a man in slow, deliberate measures, through a sky scraped pale by cold sun and a ground stiff with last season's memory. Frost clung white to bunchgrass at dawn, and the distant ridges of the Owl Creek Mountains stood like the blackened vertebrae of some vast, slumbering beast. It was a land that kept its counsel, and most men who settled there learned early that words meant little compared to silence, wind, and what could be carried on a good horse. Elias Boone Hardesty had learned that lesson the hard way, over many seasons and many rivers, before he ever set a crooked timber to soil and called the place a home. He had once been a free-ranging trapper, moving with the long, slow tide of men who followed beaver sign like a religion, setting iron along the Green, the Sweetwater, and the Popo Agie, trading pelts for powder, and lead at rendezvous where whiskey spoke louder than wisdom. In his earlier years he had ridden beside men who later found their names inked into ledgers, and journals quiet drifters who called themselves Smith, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and he had watched them pass on, thin as smoke, toward horizons that offered more desolation than reward. By the time he built his homestead at the edge of a narrow draw overlooking a crooked run of clear water, Elias was no longer a young man. The sun had worked deep lines into his face, and the wind had bleached his hair the color of old bone. His hands were scarred from trap jaws and frostbitten in 2 fingers of the left, the joints swollen and stubborn in cold weather. He carried himself with the careful economy of one who had known long hunger, and he spoke little even among his own kind. What set men talking was not Elias himself, but the object he kept wrapped in oilcloth and buffalo hide beneath the low rafters of his sod-roofed dwelling, a brittle, yellowed map that smelled faintly of old smoke and bitter herbs whenever the bundle was unrolled. It had come into his possession in a manner that never quite fitted into a clean telling. Some said he had taken it from a dying Mexican near Taos, paid for it with a mule and a sack of dried meat. Others claimed it had been traded to him by a half-mad padre who wandered north from the missions, trailing the ghosts of Spanish Jesuits and forgotten promises of silver. Elias never offered a full account, and when pressed he would only shrug and say it had found its way to him as surely as rain found a low place. The parchment was cracked like old skin. Its edges had blackened where fire once kissed it, and in places the ink had bled into soft blurs, as though the land it described had tried to erase itself. Faded script in a hand long dead named rivers and ridges in Spanish, some no longer known to any present man, and curious symbols marked certain slopes and cuts in the mountains, crosses, half-circles, and small figures that might once have been simple saints, now worn nearly smooth by time. To the men who gathered at the trading camps along the Sweetwater or the makeshift posts near South Pass, the map was a thing of ridicule. Trappers who had followed beaver into every shadowed gorge laughed into their cups over it. Old hands shook their heads and muttered that every third fool in the mountains swore he had a Spanish mine, and not one of them ever came back with more than sore bones and empty pockets. Jesuit silver, one riverman scoffed, spitting into the dust. There ain't no padres hiding treasure in these hills. Only God and the crow, and neither one trades in coin. Claim hunters newly arrived from Missouri or Illinois, sharp-eyed and restless, scoffed louder still. They spoke of surveys, claims, titles, and paper law, as if such things carried weight in a country where a man's only true deed was the rifle across his saddle and the sinew in his arms. To them, Elias was a relic, a withdrawn homesteader, clutching myths like a child clutching a broken toy. Yet the map endured, and so did Elias. On still evenings, when the light lay amber against the sod walls and the wind whispered down the draw like a low confession, he would spread the parchment across his rough-hewn table. The room would fill with that faint, ash-ghost scent, old smoke, and something sharper, almost medicinal, and his eyes, pale and steady, would trace the crooked lines as if reading a prayer no one else remembered. He did not speak of it then. He did not boast or bargain. He simply looked, the same way a man looked upon the face of a long-lost companion, searching for lines he once knew by heart. There were things on that map that no ordinary liar would have guessed. certain bends of river that matched forgotten arroyos, a narrow saddle between peaks that mirrored a place where snow never lingered long, a mark that aligned too true with a hidden spring Elias himself had once used during a lean winter of trapping. Each small agreement between parchment and ground pricked at his reason, like thorns caught in worn leather. He remembered Jedediah Smith once speaking in low tones beside a driftwood fire, recalling journeys men swore were madness, yet which his own boots had proven true. He recalled Charles Larpenteur's careful notations, the gravity with which that man set down even the simplest crossing of a river, as if to say the land itself deserved a steady witness. Those memories carried weight, more than tavern talk or drunken mockery ever could. And beneath all the rumor and denial stirred an older truth, older even than the trade itself, that Spaniards had passed through this country in centuries past, driven by faith, iron, and the hunger for metal pulled from the bones of the earth. Ruined missions rotted in distant valleys, broken rosaries turned up in soil that had never known a white man's plow. The ghost of empire lingered like chill beneath sun-warmed stone. Elias had seen such signs. A rusted fragment of chain tangled in sage, a blackened iron spike half buried beneath shale. A weathered stone marked faintly with a cross where no current man recalled placing it. These things were never proof, only whispers, but whispers have a way of taking root in a quiet spirit. So when he rolled the map and tied it closed again, his hands did so with care, born not of greed but of acknowledgment, as one handles a fragile truth too long denied. Outside his homestead, the wind rose and fell. Wolves sang their thin hymns across the valley at dusk. Trappers rode past with the slow suspicion of men who measured the world by immediate gain. None of them could see what Elias saw when he studied that smoke-scented parchment, a faint corridor through time, a thread connecting present hardship to ancient endeavor. And though he did not yet ride upon that path, though his hands still worked the soil more than the reins, the certainty grew within him like the slow tightening of winter. The map was no child's fancy. It was a memory the earth had chosen not to forget, and it had chosen him to remember it. The first true stirring of memory came to Elias Boone Hardesty, not in the quiet of his homestead, but in the dry, dust-choked streets of Taos years before he had ever driven a post into Wind River soil. It returned to him now in fragments like a dream half remembered upon waking, the taste of alkali on the tongue, the distant clang of a mission bell, and the sight of an old man leaning against an adobe wall as though the weight of a lifetime pressed down upon his bones. The vaquero had been thin as a rail, his skin cracked and darkened by the sun, his eyes pale and clouded with the weary resignation of one who had buried more friends than he could name. He wore a tattered sirop, the color of dried blood, and his hands trembled when he spoke, though his voice held no fear, only a stubbornness, sharpened by years of endurance. "You follow caminos that belong to the dead," he had told Elias in broken Spanish, his gaze cutting past him to the distant ridge where the Sangre de Cristo rose like bruised flesh against the sky. "Padres walked those slopes long before your kind crossed the plains. They dug where the stone sang back to them." Elias had frowned then, more curious than convinced. He had heard such talk before, wild tales traded for drink, rumors fattened by boredom, yet there had been something in the old man's manner that defied easy dismissal. An urgency, quiet but fierce, coiled behind every breath. From beneath his serape, the vaquero drew a battered roll of parchment bound with twine and stained with soot. The edges flaked as his fingers worried the knot loose, and when he unfolded it, a faint curl of smoke scent drifted into the air, mingling with the smells of dust and horse sweat. That same scent now haunted Elias's homestead years later, impossible to forget. "This is not Oro for fools," the old man had murmured. "This is the trail of confession. The brothers marked their path so no living man would follow it true. Only one who walks as they walked may see what lies buried." There had been no bargain shouted across a crowded camp, no bravado or raised voices. Only the quiet exchange of a mule, 2 measures of powder, and a promise Elias did not yet fully understand. When the vaquero had turned away, his stooped form swallowed by the sun-washed alleys, Elias had not known whether he had been gifted a warning or a burden. Now those words stirred again, like embers fanned by fresh wind. The men who had ridden the country north of Taos with Elias had not shared his caution. They were sharp-faced trappers, hard in the jaw and harder in the eye, and they spoke around their fires with the easy cruelty of men who had outlived many friends and trusted few truths. "Spanish priests bury silver, eh?" one had laughed, chewing on a twist of rawhide. "Then they must also bury whole kingdoms and fools who go searchin'." Another spat into the fire and shook his head. "Jesuits ain't never come this far north with packs full of coin. They left crosses and prayers, not plunder." But Elias noted how even the loudest men lowered their voices when the talk turned serious, how their eyes slid toward the dark line of the mountains at night, as though something unseen waited there, neither hostile nor kind, only patient. The old trade routes carried more than pelts and powder. They carried rumor, drifting slow and steady like ash on a long wind. From the Cimarron to the Huerfano, whispers spoke of abandoned shafts hidden inside gulches, of strange marks cut into stone that no American hand remembered carving. Some stories contradicted the map in his possession, others matched it close enough to unsettle any thinking man, and threaded through all of it ran the quiet presence of danger. Blackfeet. Riders had been seen far from their usual ground, their movements swift and silent as storm shadow. Crow scouts lingered watchful on distant ridges, their silhouettes breaking the horizon like sharp questions. Men vanished along lonely tracks, not claimed by wolf or weather. The trail itself seemed to draw blood with deliberate hunger. Elias felt it in the drag of the reins and the tightening in his chest when the night sky swallowed the last of the light. This was not land that surrendered easily to blind ambition. It demanded respect, and it punished those who mistook bravado for wisdom. Still, when he studied the map by the faint flicker of a pine-knotted lantern, he saw more than wild conjecture. The drawn lines echoed the descriptions he had once heard murmured beside shared fires. A hidden bowl of white stone where wind never settled dust. A narrow ravine split by a ribbon of cold water so pure it burned the throat. Grotesque little symbols, once baffling, began to align, with remembered terrain and half-forgotten talk. It was not suddenly clear. It was slowly convincing, like the steady wearing of boot heel upon hard earth. His mind returned again and again to the vaquero's words. "Only one who walks as they walked may see what lies buried." If the padres had walked in silence, so must he. If they had trusted patience over haste, he would do the same. He did not yet gather men or speak openly of intention. Instead, he rode the edges of familiar ground, letting horseflesh and instinct carry him along routes the parchment hinted at. Each small match between ink and land tightened something in his chest. He did not call it faith. He called it listening. And as the days shortened and the wind took on the sharper scent of frost, Elias knew that the country was no longer merely a place of survival. It had become a question, one the map insisted he answer, even if the answer waited somewhere along a trail already stained with older blood. To the men who passed along the thin trail that snaked through Elias Boone Hardesty's stretch of river bottom, the structure he raised there looked less like a home and more like the stubborn whim of a half-softened mind. The walls were low, packed thick with sod and clay, as many frontier dwellings were, but it was the roof that drew the quiet laughter and sidelong looks. Where other cabins crouched under steep shake or rough split pine, Elias angled his roof broad and shallow, layering it with a strange patience that defied common sense. First came heavy timbers, squared by hand and sunk deep into the earth like the ribs of a buried beast. Over these he laid interwoven willow and sapling lattice, bent green and pegged tight until the whole frame resembled a vast, sloping basket. Upon that he pressed thick sod cut from the river bank, heavy with its own roots and weight, sealing every seam with a mixture of wet clay, ash, and crushed limestone. Finally, over the ridgeline he stretched cured elk hide, drawn tight and treated with tallow and pine pitch until it shone dark and stubborn as storm cloud. To watching eyes, it looked suffocating, a roof that could not breathe, a roof that would sink, rot, or collapse under its unnatural bulk. "Man's trying to bury himself while still alive," one trapper muttered as he rode past, reins loose and smile sharp as broken glass. "That ain't a roof, that's a grave mound." Even older settlers shook their grizzled heads. "Fire'll take it sure," they said, "or rot, or both. Ain't right none." Elias did not answer. He simply worked, his hands steady, his mouth set in the same quiet line it wore when he studied the map that breathed faint smoke into his lamplight. He had learned long before that the mountains did not reward a man for explaining himself. They rewarded him only for foresight and for a knowing patience born of experience others had not yet paid for. He remembered winters when dry pine, roofs turned to tinder beneath wandering sparks, lightning that leapt from cloud to timber and swallowed whole homesteads in moments. He remembered trappers who had lost every pelt and tool to flame that chewed faster than a man could run. Fire, in this country, was never merely accident, it was verdict. So Elias built against verdict. He packed each layer tight, smoothing his careful ridge with the deliberate touch of one mending a wound. He fashioned narrow vents lined with river stone, angled so smoke might rise, yet flame be denied its reach. Beneath the outer sod he worked a burial of damp earth and fine mineral grit, sealing it as one seals a coffin against rain. When at last the roof lay finished and dark beneath a brooding sky, the wind running its fingers across the packed turf, Elias stepped back and studied it not with pride, but with a calm recognition. This roof had not come from whim. It had come from memory, from watching men lose everything to careless sparks and sudden wrath. And so the test came, as such tests always did. In late summer, when the grasses stood dry and brittle as old parchment and the air held that sharpened tension that precedes mountain storm, a jagged line of thunder tore open the western sky. Lightning cracked down across the ridgeline and leapt in hissing forks toward the valley, setting small tongues of flame licking through brittle sage. The wind rose fierce and erratic, shouldering sparks across the ground like scattered seeds. By dusk, smoke rolled low and thick around Elias's homestead. He stood upon the rise, hat pulled low, eyes narrowed, calculating not where to flee, but where the fire would speak loudest if allowed. A drifting ember caught upon the darkened elk hide of his roof and blossomed briefly, a bright, impatient flare. Nearby settlers watched, half hidden, already resigned in their minds to the coming ruin. But the ember faltered. It hissed softly as moisture bled from deeper layers beneath and died, leaving only a faint scar in the pitch-black surface. Again and again the wind hurled sparks against the structure. Again and again they faded, smothered by earth, damp hide, and packed resistance. The roof held silent, unyielding an answer no words could have framed more clearly. Days later, when the ash had settled and the valley lay charred beyond recognition, men rode closer. They dismounted. They laid hands to the walls as if touching a miracle born of stubborn ignorance. Their earlier laughter fell hollow in their throats. "That damn roof," one murmured finally, voice rough with reluctant awe. "It ain't natural." Elias only nodded once. He knew better than to name what was simply the result of having paid attention longer than most men cared to endure. And all the while, beneath that same roof, the smoke-scented map lay bound in its hide and oilcloth, waiting like a second structure unseen, doubted, but patient as drying earth. What Elias had done to keep his home against fire and rot, he now began to understand he must also do with the truth the map whispered into his solitude. A man who builds against ruin once does so again. And as the cold crept back into the nights and the last beaver pelts stretched thin upon their frames, Elias felt a quiet certainty settle over him that the design others called madness had already proven itself. That the path others mocked would soon do the same. Some shelters were raised against storm, others were raised against forgetting. And both, in their own patient manner, stood waiting to be tested by the full weight of the frontier. The decision did not come to Elias Boone Hardesty in any sudden blaze of revelation. It crept forward with the season, as quiet and inevitable as frost creeping into the low places of the land. He rose before light for many mornings in succession, saddled his horse without haste, and rode eastward into country that carried the old scent both of promise and warning. He told no man his full intent. In a land where loose tongues often led to loose graves, silence was a form of protection. He traveled light, as Jedediah Smith had once advised, in that low, careful manner which suggested both wisdom and exhaustion. Powder dry, lead counted, knife sharp, provisions measured with a miser's precision. The rest would be provided by the same hand that had shaped the ridgelines, and that hand did not favor carelessness. The map rode folded within his coat, its presence more felt than seen. Each time he removed it to compare line with horizon, he did so with the gravity of a man consulting Scripture. The inked contours echoed the terrain with unnerving fidelity. A shallow bend in the river where the current slowed into jade pools, a jutting tooth of red stone visible from miles out. A narrow defile where cottonwoods clung pale and shivering to a thin thread of water. The longer he followed, the more the land itself seemed to acknowledge the old Spanish hand that had once traced its bones. He moved along sections of trail long ago beaten by men who now haunted only memory. A set of wagon ruts half swallowed by grass. A forgotten camp ring littered with ancient charcoal. A broken horseshoe rusted nearly to scaleless red, its curve still holding the faint echo of some animal's burdened gait. These were the quiet landmarks of those who passed and left nothing but suggestion behind. In such places Elias recalled more clearly the stories told of Smith's crossing through these latitudes, how he had moved where maps ended and speculation began, trusting more to compass and observation than to rumor. Men had called Smith mad in his time, and yet the land had remembered him with a reverence it did not afford louder men. Elias found himself speaking the name aloud, once as he rode, the syllables lost in the wide silence, a kind of acknowledgment, a sign that he walked not alone, even now. The weather turned fickle as he pushed higher into broken country. Cold gusts scoured the ridgelines, and brief curtains of sleet marched across the near peaks, curt and unforgiving. He sheltered in shallow caves and under bolting pines, stripping bark for fire and letting his horse graze lean grass with wary hunger. Each night the map was drawn, the present compared with the past, the mind eased only by careful verification. He began to see between the lines not merely what the ink described, but what it intentionally omitted. The padres, whoever they had been, had not drawn for convenience. Their marks favored concealment. Their symbols layered obscurity upon fact, as though understanding that the greatest protection lay not in guarding treasure, but in misdirecting those who sought it. At one narrow reach, where rock walls tightened like clasped hands, a symbol formed of two intersecting arcs caught Elias's attention. He dismounted and studied the stone face until he noticed the faint groove on granite, nearly erased by centuries of weather. He traced it with gloved hand. It matched the line upon the parchment as closely as any mark could manage beneath open sky. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the gravity of validation. This was no wandering fancy. This was design. 2 days beyond that point he crested a long rise and saw before him a basin encircled by slanted stone, pale and bare, where no tree took root. The air carried a hollow echo, as if the place itself remembered sound more keenly than silence. Wind slid along its edges with a faint whistle, rising through cracks so narrow a man would need to breathe sideways to pass. The map named this place in fading script, a title nearly lost to time. Elias could not read it fully, but the shape of the land answered its meaning with quiet certainty. Here the earth thinned its voice. He circled cautiously, measuring every approach with the care of a man who knew that discovery often exacted its price before reward was ever glimpsed. There were signs of passage older than memory, a flattened trail shaped not by buffalo nor elk, but by deliberate, burdened feet. Stone piles placed with intention rather than chance. A shallow cleft where water had long since ceased to run, yet the soil beneath remained faintly damp. He knelt and pressed his palm to it. The cold bit hard, yet something remained alive beneath the crust. "Smith," he murmured again, voice low, "you'd have seen this too." Whether in reverence or defiance he could not say. Night gathered early, and he made camp upon the perimeter of the basin, where ground rose faintly higher and view widened clear. Fire was kept low, smothered as much as flame allowed. He ate sparingly, eyes never straying long from the pale ring of stone below. Somewhere beyond, unseen and perhaps ancient, lay the hinge upon which the map turned from memory into truth. Sleep came thin and fragile, broken by wind and the distant call of something moving along unseen ridge. When dawn crept pale and unyielding across the western spine, Elias rose, stiff but resolved. The basin awaited him with the same silent patience it had held for centuries, its secrets breathing slow beneath crusted shadow. He rolled the map once more beneath his arm and stepped forward without ceremony, for the land had begun to answer, and Elias Boone Hardesty was no longer merely following ink and legend. He was walking the ghost of a path that had refused to die. The basin did not yield its heart quickly. Elias Boone Hardesty stepped into its pale ring as one steps into a church long abandoned, aware that what lay ahead demanded reverence more than boldness. The stone beneath his boots felt strangely cool, as though the sun itself had never fully claimed this hollow. Every sound carried thin and sharp his breath, the soft grind of leather, the faint creak of saddle gear, until even the smallest movement seemed an intrusion upon something older than memory. He walked its perimeter slow and deliberate, reading the land the way he once read currents for beaver sign. There were no sudden revelations, no shining entrance splitting the earth open like a wound. Instead, there were subtleties, patterns men impatient for reward would have passed over. A line of rock set too evenly to be chance. A shallow depression where hooves had once churned damp soil into hardened ruts. A cleft sheltered from wind where shadow persisted long after the sun had stretched its reach across the slopes. And there, upon a slab of gray granite half buried beneath gravel, a faint cross cut so fine it seemed almost imagined. Elias crouched and brushed the surface clean with his glove. The groove answered his touch, real and stubborn. He eased his knife from its sheath and traced the line as if confirming a pulse. The map bore the same sign, marked beside symbols he had long pondered with equal care and caution. Here, then, he searched until his hands smarted and his back tightened, until the rhythm of movement carried a solemn steadiness. Beneath a low outcrop where sage had thinned and stone jutted sharp and unyielding, he found what the land had guarded with long patience, a narrow slit dark as a blind eye, partially obscured by shattered rock and thorn. It did not announce itself as treasure or promise. It appeared instead as a wound the earth had tried to close and not quite managed. He knelt beside the opening and listened. The air rising from it carried a stale, mineral tang that spoke not of death, but of depths unfamiliar to open sky. When he loosened the rocks with careful force, the passage widened just enough to admit the bent passage of a man. He did not hurry. He lit a short torch from dry resin and stepped forward, the flame trembling as it tasted the ancient breath of whatever lay beyond. The tunnel swallowed him. Stone pressed close on either side, sweat slick and cold, its surface scarred by tools long rotted to memory. The walls bore faint stains where iron had kissed them again and again, and in places shallow niches opened like forgotten alcoves, their shelves bare save for brittle splinters and dust packed hard as baked clay. His torchlight thrown against the interior revealed more crosses, more half-erased inscriptions in Spanish, their meaning cracked by time yet heavy with solemn intent. These passages had not been gouged by thieves or reckless men. They had been hewn with careful purpose by hands that labored as much in prayer as in toil. He moved deeper, breath slow, every nerve alive to sound. Beyond the first bend, the tunnel broadened into a low chamber where timbers, blackened with age, still braced the ceiling like old ribs holding against collapse by stubborn memory alone. On the ground lay fragments of hammered metal, bent nails, a rusted pick whose handle long since surrendered to rot. Toward the far side of the chamber he saw it, the faint glimmer that caught even dull flame with secret hunger, veins of pale silver, threading the stone like ghosts trying to remember their form. He did not speak, he did not reach, he only stared, his breath hitching once, then settling again under the weight of quiet realization. So the padres had indeed come here. So their silence had purpose. So the map, ridiculed and doubted, had not lied. The find did not stir wild joy or drunken triumph. It stirred instead a heavy awareness, as if the land itself had allowed him glimpse of something it did not surrender lightly, and would undoubtedly exact payment for in its own appointed time. Outside, the wind shifted tone, carrying distant echoes of movement. Elias recognized too well the faint clatter of stone under careless boot, the whisper of brush disturbed by human haste. He extinguished the torch at once and pressed his ear to the wall. The passage beyond his makeshift entrance trembled faintly with sound more measured than animal wander or drifting breeze. Voices. Low. Calculating. Claim hunters or men drawn by. Rumor. Following secrets he had thought his alone. He backed deeper into the shadow, letting the tunnel close its mouth around him as protective as grave soil. Within the cold restraint of that forgotten mine he felt no panic, only the tightening realization that discovery never belonged to one man alone, and that what lay hidden beneath stone now stood balanced between revelation and blood. Above, the mountains held their breath. Below, the old silver slept uneasy. And Elias Boone Hardesty understood at last that the true trial of the map had only just begun. The first shot cracked the mountain silence like the tearing of old cloth. Elias Boone Hardesty did not flinch so much as narrow his world into sharp, necessary shape. The report echoed down the stone throat of the mine, striking the walls and returning in hollow fragments, until even his own breathing became indistinct among the noise. Dust sifted loose from the ceiling and trembled in soft gray curtains across his shoulders. He pressed himself deeper against the cold rock and waited. Another voice followed, harsh and impatient. "He's in there. No doubt about it. I seen the horse. Damn fool thinks he can claim the old padre's fortune for himself." Boots scraped, shifting weight. A muted oath. The scrape of metal against stone as someone drew steel too quickly for wisdom. Elias closed his eyes once, not in surrender, but in steady reckoning. He had known, as surely as he knew the coming of winter, that such a moment would arrive. The frontier did not honor finders. It honored only those strong enough to hold what they discovered, and even then, rarely for long. He slid further back into the shadowed corridor, moving with the same silence he had once used stalking elk through broken timber. Each careful step spoke of long seasons, surviving where haste meant grave. His hand found the cool shape of his rifle where it rested against the rock, its weight familiar as breath. The men above spoke again, their tone sharpened not by courage, but by hunger. "Jesuit silver don't belong to no trapper ghost," one scoffed. "We take the whole, we take what's inside. That's frontier law enough." Frontier law. Elias nearly smiled at the emptiness of those words. A flicker of weak lamplight crept inward, bobbing uncertain against the lower tunnel walls. Someone confirmed the entrance true. Footfalls echoed heavier now, confident and uninvited, drawing closer through the darkness that had sheltered the mine for untold years. When the first shadow broke into the chamber, Elias fired. The blast thundered outward, the recoil tearing into his shoulder as stone swallowed the echo. The flicker of flame vanished in an instant. A cry followed, sharp and startled, then cut short by the weight of collapse. Another man swore, panic scraping the edges of his boldness. "Back, damn it, back!" The second voice hissed, suddenly stripped of certainty. But retreat did not come without desperation. A second muzzle flare spat light into the tunnel, bullets striking stone close enough to fill the air with biting dust. Elias rolled aside, his coat brushing grit as he found better cover behind a jutting ridge of rock. He loaded with practiced hands, movements as measured as prayer. There was no speech between them now. Only the bitter understanding that the earth they intruded upon had chosen quiet violence over negotiation. When the echoes diminished, a tense hush settled. Somewhere near the entrance a man groaned low, the sound threading thin through the stony passage. Beyond that, only the restless shuffle of indecision. Elias did not pursue. This ground was older than their quarrel, and he would not stain its secret with unnecessary blood. He remained still until at last the second man's boots turned away, printed retreat carrying frustration and thwarted greed back into the open basin. Then silence reclaimed the mine, slow and solemn. He relit his torch with cautious patience and stepped out once more into the pale wounded daylight. Smoke from distant grass fires already trailed along the western slopes, blackening the horizon in low curtains. The valley had not yet erupted, but the warning hung visible as omen. He knew then that this discovery could not remain buried. Once rumor touched tongue, and tongue carried to hand, fire would follow. It always did, not only of timber and grass, but of intent, betrayal, and the cruel possession men called ambition. By dusk he had sealed the entrance as best as stone could hide what men now knew existed. He returned toward his homestead under a sky-colored bruised purple by approaching storm. Each mile felt heavier than the last, not from fatigue alone, but from the weight of knowledge now breathing against his ribs. The storm did not delay its hand. Lightning tore the horizon again that night, leaping across ridges already dry with summer neglect. Wind drove flame with ferocity, and fire ran the land like a furious confession. Elias reached his home while sparks already licked the outer sage, and the sky rained burning ash as though the heavens themselves had turned vengeful. He stood for a moment upon the rise and watched his roof face the advancing surge. The same roof they had mocked. The same design called madness. Flame reached its dark sod and elk-hide surface, hissed, faltered, and retreated. Smoke curled upward in long strained ribbons, but the structure held, sealed against the ravening teeth of combustion. Around it, grass blackened, nearby wind-thrown debris flared then dimmed, but the dwelling itself stood resolved into unyielding quiet. Within its shelter Elias waited while chaos passed around him like a fevered tide. The map lay buried beneath packed floor and shadow, untouched, patient, as if aware that both man and roof had been built for this trial. When glow at last faded to cold embers and the wind whispered its exhaustion across scorched earth, only ruins remained where lesser structures had clung hopeful and unprepared. Elias stepped back into the unbroken stillness of dawn and surveyed the scarred valley, his home standing alone amid smoke and ash. And in that quiet he understood something deeper than fear or defiance. The fire that tried to take him had only proven the same truth the map had whispered from the beginning, that survival in this country belonged not to the loudest hand, nor the sharpest gun, but to the one who prepared in silence for what others refused to believe would come. The valley did not heal quickly. Where fire and thunder had passed, the land lay stripped and darkened, its old colors swallowed by a skin of ash and quiet sorrow. Blackened stone still radiated faint warmth long after the flames had fled, and the charred skeletons of sagebrush clawed at the air like fingers frozen mid-plea. It was a landscape reborn in silence, as though the earth itself were breathing slow and deliberate in the aftermath of violence it had witnessed too often. Elias Boone Hardesty walked its edges with the same careful tread he had learned in youth, when even the smallest sign might mean the difference between life and vanishing. He bent to inspect scorched soil where green had once curled, and he nodded faintly at the stubborn shoots already rising through crust and ruin. The land, like men fashioned by it, remembered how to persist. He knew that the mine could not remain forgotten now. Word had already slipped beyond his control, carried perhaps by the wounded hunter who fled, or by some watcher hidden deeper in the ridges. Rumor traveled in the mountains faster than hoofbeat, and soon enough others would follow its call, armed not with caution, but with appetite. Yet he felt no urge to announce his discovery or mark his claim with grand defiance. The map, the mine, the roof that had saved his shelter, all had spoken the same quiet law: endurance over display, wisdom over spectacle. So he returned, once more to the basin, stepping along the faded trail as though revisiting a place already etched upon his bones. The entrance he had sealed showed faint disturbance where hands had tested stone and failed. Fresh boot prints dented the softer earth nearby, careless and impatient, as if the men who left them had mistaken urgency for right. Elias did not curse them. He simply restored the stones again with patient precision, knowing the illusion of concealment mattered as much as true isolation. The mine would wait. It had waited for centuries. It could wait a while longer still. When he left the basin that morning, he turned his back, not in abandonment, but in respect. Some truths required distance before they allowed understanding to ripen. Back at his homestead, the roof stood dark and resolute against clean sky, its surface scarred but intact. Inside, the map lay discoloring further with time, its lines softening as though eager to dissolve back into forgotten fiber. But Elias understood now that even when parchment failed, the land retained its knowing. Men from nearby settlements came eventually, drawn by whispers that had hardened into half-certainty. They rode slow and cautious, eyes measuring everything they passed, and their voices softened when they approached his door. "We heard talk," one said, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that hesitated between suspicion and grudging respect. "Spanish holes, silver buried by priests. Thought you might know something of it." Elias studied them the way he studied weather, carefully, without haste. "There's always talk of silver," he answered evenly. "Most of it turns to dust before a man ever reaches it." They waited for more, but he offered none. The silence hung heavy and instructive. Eventually, they rode on, less certain than when they arrived. Seasons began their slow turning again. Autumn rang gold across the lower slopes. Snow traced quiet lines against the high passes. The map grew, thinner each time Elias unrolled it. And yet the memory of its intent deepened within him like river running beneath ice. He no longer needed the ink to tell him where the mine slept, nor did he measure its worth in coin or extractable metal. What the padres had left behind was more than ore. It was the story of men who labored vanished paths, who walked and marked and trusted that the earth would remember their striving long after their names surrendered.